Today is March 3rd, 2025, and before introducing today's guests, I want to share the results of our annual poll of your favorite episodes of last year, 2024. I want to thank everyone who voted. Here are the top 10 in a tie for 10th. How the Constitution Can Bring Us Together with Yuval Levin, and Misinformation and the Three Languages of Politics with Arnold Kling. Number 9, a tie, The Mysterious World of Owls with Jennifer Ackerman, Why Industrial Policy is Almost Always a Bad Idea with Scott Sumner, and Injustice and the Letter from Birmingham Jail with Dwayne Betts. Number 8, The Underrated Bruno Leone with Michael Munger. Number 7, Why Housing is Artificially Expensive and What Can Be Done About It with Brian Kaplan. Number 6, Glenn Loury Tells All. Number 5, Does Market Failure Justify Government Intervention with Michael Munger. Number 4, The Good, Bad, and the Ugly of the COVID Vaccine with Vinay Prasad. Number 3, The Problems of Boys and Men in Today's America with Richard Reeves. And tied for first place, 2 episodes, What Modern Medicine Gets Wrong with Marty McCary, and Terrorism, Israel, and Dreams of Peace with Haviv Reda-Gur. I want to again thank everyone for voting. We'll have links to all of those episodes that made the top 10. And I would remind listeners that we have a category called Favorites, where you can listen to past year's favorite episodes of listeners. And now for today's guest, author and educational consultant, Daisy Christodoulou. She was last year in February of 2025 talking about COAS, the rules of the game, and the costs of perfection. Her Substack is entitled No More Marking. And for listeners not from the United Kingdom, marking is what we call grading in the United States. And I don't know what they call it anywhere else. But our topic for today is feedback in education and the potential of AI to provide feedback. Daisy, welcome back to EconTalk.
Great to be here again, Russ.
We're going to base this conversation on some recent essays of yours at your Substack, No More Marking, and we'll link to those for readers to check out. Am I correct? That is what people in Britain call
grading, yes, you're right. So marking in a technical sense in the UK means the application of a number or grade to a piece of work. So yes, although I will say that a number of people in the UK don't think that's what it means either. So maybe in that sense we're misnamed, but it is a great name. So
let's start by talking about feedback. You write that it can be a thermometer or a thermostat. Explain that phrase.
Absolutely. So when it comes to education, I think anyone working in education will talk about the importance of feedback. It's a very popular topic, I think, with teachers and with students, the idea that you need to get some idea of how you're doing to improve. But feedback is obviously a very, very important concept beyond education. And the origins of that, it's not a term that's used a lot now, but maybe cybernetics, the origins of these sort of control systems, the origins of information technology. A lot of the origins of those fields of study are in the concept of feedback, of how you change a system based on inputs. And so a really nice way of thinking about feedback in that more general sense is to think about a thermometer and a thermostat. So a thermometer is a measurement tool. It will measure the temperature. A thermostat will change the temperature based on the thermometer's reading. And I apply that analogy to educational feedback by saying that a teacher can give feedback where they can just kind of give a measurement, read a measurement of the student's work, and that would be maybe to just give the grade, to say this is the standard it is at. But when we talk about feedback, what we are hoping is that you will be able to give the student some kind of information that will move them closer to the goal state. So the aim of feedback in that technical sense in any sector is to think of something that will move you closer to your goal state. So in the case of the thermometer, we have the reading, and the thermostat, if the reading of the thermometer is too low, so if the thermometer comes back 18 degrees Celsius and you have a goal state you want to achieve of 20, the thermostat will kick on the heating and it will then stop when we get to 20. And likewise, if your thermometer comes back at 22 and your goal state is 20, you will then this thermostat will switch on the air conditioning and bring that temperature down. The aim with educational feedback is we have a goal state. I was an English teacher. We have, what will our goal state be? Our goal state is we want our students to read fluently, infer insightfully, write coherently. How do we move them from where they are at the moment to that goal state? We could also think about the goal state in terms of grades. If you want to say, well, they are a grade C and we want to move them to a grade A. So what we have to do in some way, shape or form is provide feedback that will close the gap between the actual state, where the student is at the moment, and the goal state. And as I say, this is something that is crucial in so many parts of information technology, of so many parts of the world, but it's of big interest to teachers as well.
Of course, in education, if I say to you, you've earned a C, some people say, great, oh, that's fantastic. I didn't think I was going to get such a good grade. And they're done. But others will say, oh, I need to improve. Yeah. And as you point out, the letter grade or the number grade, a 73, doesn't tell you how to improve. It just says there's room for improvement. And in addition, it doesn't really by itself tell you where the holes are. There could be things that you're doing at a good level, at a quality level, and there could be things that you're doing that are inadequate, but overall it's a C, in which case it's not very helpful to tell you where to start other than to try harder. And trying harder, by the way, is not usually a very helpful bit of advice. I want to make, as we go on, I want to make a distinction between two kinds of feedback that we might consider. One is writing, and a lot of what you wrote about in your essays is about giving feedback on written essays. And the second, I would say, is we would call content knowledge, which could include something simple like, do you get the facts right? But it also could include, are you able to apply the knowledge you've gained to other things, which would be the highest level. My favorite bad piece of feedback that I received as a teacher was when a student gave me a 1 on a scale of 1 to 5 and said, this course is unfair. Professor Roberts expects us to apply the material to things we've never seen before. And I used to read that, of course, at the beginning of every class because that was the goal of the course. But these two types of feedback, suggestions, we might call them, on an essay or evaluation on an essay, and then content and application, I think are different. Do you agree with me?
Yes, I can see what you're saying. Do you mean what you're talking about? Both types of feedback could be in the form of something that the teacher has written at the bottom of a student's response. Yeah. So there are, of course, all kinds of different categories that you could say that those comments would be in. So I'm concerned a lot now in my day job with technical accuracy of students' writing. So I tend to think a lot about things to do with sentence structure and apostrophes and tense. So that's one category. Another category is just getting the facts right in terms of what they're writing about. So an example I always give is there was a play that I used to teach quite a lot called An Inspector Calls when I was an English teacher. And a really common basic factual error would be the students would mix up two characters. There was a character called Gerald and a character called Eric, and they'd mix them up. And it wasn't the worst mistake in the world, and it didn't mean they couldn't be making some other really excellent points, but it was really confusing, and it would confuse them, and it was not great. So that's a really good example. And then I think then the other bit you're talking about is then your ability to perhaps have those higher order analysis and application to other ideas, and perhaps those things which really elevate a piece of writing to the top levels. Are those the kind of things that you're thinking about?
Well, I'm thinking about the history of the comments I've seen typically on my kids' papers and on my own papers, and on sometimes when I was giving feedback, the feedback I would give to a certain kind of answer. And the example I would give would be, I would write in the margin, or I would see in the margin, awkward.
Yes.
Or yes. Confusing.
Yes.
Confusing. You circle a paragraph and say confusing. And the student, it took me a long time before I realized, and you know this quite well, you write about it, the student reads that and goes, okay, now what? And that's different than, Gerald and Eric are two different characters, and you go, I got them confused. Okay, I get it now. I got to might have to reread the play and learn. So,
although, go on, carry on.
No, go ahead.
So what I would say is that actually, I get the distinction you're making of those different categories, but I would actually say in all of those categories, I suppose my slightly heretical thought for somebody like you, spent a lot of time giving and receiving written feedback, is that written feedback is not optimal for any of these categories. And that written feedback is not a particularly effective way of doing feedback.
Okay, so let's take essay, both grading and education. You're involved in a number of projects, which I find utterly fascinating. We'll get into a little more detail. We touched on in your previous episode, but you're involved in some projects of thinking about how do we scale grading and feedback. But what I'm having in mind here is that, you know, a student writes an essay and it's mediocre. There are many, many, many ways it can be mediocre. It could be written in the wrong tone. It could have factual errors. It could lack sparkle. It could be, so it's, we would call it flat. And as a result, it gets a mediocre grade, a C plus, a B minus, whatever it is, depending on the system. And the student gets that grade and thinks, how do I do this better? So the next level up is to say, well, I've told you where it's better. When I wrote awkward, that meant you should try to rewrite that. And so I'm curious what, if written, I'm going to disagree with you in a minute about written feedback. I think there is some written feedback that could help. But if I don't give that student written feedback, what do I do for them?
Right, great question. So let's just also think about I'll just quick thing before we get into the meat of this, which is the big question, you know, I do want to get into, but also just about age groups here. So I taught students aged 11 to 18. That's where a lot of my expertise is. I now do a lot of work with 11 to 18, but also younger, so 5 to 11. But I've also been a peer-reviewed author on an academic paper where I got written feedback from the peer reviewers. And what I'm saying, I think, holds true, I would say, across the age ranges. So there's some of what I'm saying, I think, that holds true from ages 5 up to however old you are when you're writing your peer review papers. Some of what I'm saying is truer for certain age groups than others. But there is a central point here that I think is true across all of the age groups. So however you're involved with giving and receiving written feedback, I think there are points I make here which hold true across those ranges. And the central point I will make, which we touched on last time I spoke to you, is that prose is not optimized for action. Prose is not optimized to move you on to that next level. And the central philosophical, theoretical piece behind this is, again, someone I talked about in the last episode I did with you and who you have talked about since, and you talk about a lot, which is Michael Polanyi. So Michael Polanyi's entire theory of tacit knowledge is that there are things that we can do, but we cannot tell. There are a whole bunch of stuff out there that we do have this intuitive, real understanding and sense of, but it's very hard to put that into words. And I can give you some examples. Polanyi's classic example is riding a bike. You can think about also if you're swimming, learning to float. If you read an entire book on how to ride a bike and then you put the book down and you go and try and ride the bike, is that time spent reading the book better or worse than some time spent actually with your mum or dad on the bike trying to get your balance? So obviously the latter is more important. And so the central point I'm making that I think holds true across the range is that prose is not optimized for improvement. And I can let's carry on. I can keep going. I'll keep going.
Yeah.
But
Go on a little bit more.
Let me give you an example. And so, as I say, I would say Polanyi is the kind of guiding philosophical point behind this. But let me give you some really practical examples. So there is a modern education writer called Dylan William, a big name in the field of education and assessment and feedback. And he has given the most brilliant example of how this plays out in a middle school classroom. And he says he was visiting a middle school classroom and the students had all been given quite detailed written feedback on a science investigation that they just completed. And one of the students had been given the feedback, you need to make your scientific inquiries more systematic. And Dylan Williams says to the student, what do you understand by that? What are you going to do differently next time? And the student says, I don't know. If I'd known how to be more systematic, I would have been so the first time. And that's obviously a flippant response, and you can imagine the kind of student who gives that kind of response. I taught students like that. But when I read that paragraph, when I read that paragraph in Dylan William, I cringed because I had spent large chunks of my life as a teacher writing feedback like that, large chunks particularly of my Sunday evenings. And not only had I done that, I had done that because it was recommended as best practice. So the best practice when I was training as a teacher, and I've since realised that this is often seen as best practice in many other schools and countries that I now work in, including the US. The best practice is seen to take the language of the mark scheme and give that language back to the student. That's the most transparent way of getting them to understand how to do better. And the one I was probably guilty of, because I would copy it from the mark scheme, was saying to students, writing down, you need to infer more insightfully. Now, this is what Dylan William would say is true but useless. It is TBU. Yeah. It is like telling an unsuccessful comedian to tell funnier jokes.
Funnier.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yes, it's true. But what do you do? What is the action that you take as a result of that? So if we go back to the thermometer thermostat, this is not closing the gap. So this leads on to my next point, which is that the thing you need to do to close the gap and the action you need to take, I just explained via Polanyi why prose is not optimized to do that. So a lot of people will say to me, oh, well, that teacher's feedback, it wasn't precise or specific enough. They needed to really give the specific action step. And my point is, prose is not good for this. You need something else. So what is that something else? Dylan William, he talks about it as being a recipe for action. And he also, I think quite rightly, talks about sport. That actually often in sport, we have a much better idea of the action steps you need to take to get from your current state to your goal state. And the crucial insight here, which I think is not fully appreciated enough in education, is that the actions you need to take to get from your actual state to your goal state can often look very different to either the actual state or the goal state. Let me give a concrete example. You've written your piece of writing, you've written your essay. And let's say you need to infer more insightfully. That is true. This student needs to infer more insightfully. What is inference? What do you need to do to be better at inferring? Well, actually, that's a huge thing. And what we know you need to do to be better at inferring, you need to have a wider vocabulary and more background knowledge. That's actually what allows you to make inferences. So what I would say is, in the case of that student who needs to infer more insightfully, you could do a sequence of lessons with them on teaching them new vocabulary and perhaps some new prefixes and suffixes which will help them expand their vocabulary even further. That would be an activity which will help them improve to move from the actual state to the goal state. But it doesn't look like writing an essay. It doesn't look like the piece of work that you submitted or the piece of work that you're going to be doing. In fact, in those lessons where you're learning about new words, you may never hold a pen or write. But my argument is that will help you get to your goal state. And if we think about this, Dylan Williams is very keen on talking about this in the context of sports, and I am too. And a big metaphor that I used in my second book, Making Good Progress, I use the metaphor, which I think people really understand. They get this more than they do when I talk about it in the context of academics. I use the metaphor of running a marathon. So let's imagine you want to learn to run a marathon and you've never run a marathon before and you have 3 to 6 months to train. Do you go out and run a marathon in every single training practice session? No, you do not. Do you think that the only way you can measure your improvement from your actual state to your goal state is to run a marathon and then run another one and then see if you've got any faster? No, you do not. What you do is you set up a training plan. You will increase your mileage gradually and you will build into that training plan activities that do not involve running, that do not look like running. So one of the reasons people often struggle with marathon running is they need to build up their muscles to allow them to get to those heavy mileages. So you have to do often, and I speak from experience, I have run one marathon, you have to do strength work in the gym and things like yoga and have massages and do some strength and conditioning. You have to do all these things which don't look like running to make yourself a better runner. And the same is true in academics. That there are a bunch of things you can do that will make you a better writer that do not look like writing. And I would argue that is true not just for total novices, but also for more advanced students who are at a more advanced level. And with the marathon analogy, I would hold true as well, that spending time in the gym is important for novice runners. You look at elite marathon runners, they will do that too. So I would say that one of the big issues we have in education with the written feedback, not the only issue, but one of the big issues, is that the written feedback kind of encourages you to maybe just focus on redoing the work in some way, when what you actually need to do is to step back and think, what the term I use in my book is model of progression. You need to step back and think there is a model of progression here. There are some steps we need to take. What are these steps we need to take? Which steps are missing? And some of these steps will not look like doing another piece of writing. They will involve something very different. Well,
I think that's extremely interesting, and I agree with a lot of it, but not all of it. So let me give you where I'm a little bit, I disagree. One of the challenges, the reason sports analogies are so attractive is that we know a lot about sports and we think about them and we can often measure improvement, which is much harder in the kind of academic environment we're thinking about. So an analogy that I would agree with you 100% on, I've used it before. I love it because it was so insightful for me, is in baseball. If you're having trouble hitting the ball well, a coach will often say, keep your eye on the ball. It's really good advice. It's also really hard to do. And if you don't explain why it's hard to do, and I didn't realize this until I coached baseball, the reason it's hard to do is because when you're hitting a baseball, your body is turning counterclockwise. But as the ball comes in, your head has to turn clockwise because it's seeing the ball coming from the pitcher's hand. And this could be cricket for those of you listening at home outside the United States or places where baseball is played. But when the ball's coming toward you, as it gets closer and closer, if you're going to watch it close to where it's going to hit the bat, you have to turn your head in the opposite direction you're turning your body. This is not natural. And basically, you have to train to do that. You have to practice that motion in some dimension. Not literally, probably, but being aware of that's very useful. So that's good feedback, but it's not enough, but it's good feedback compared to the keep your eye on the ball, which is useless feedback.
That's a fantastic example. That's a fantastic example.
Thank you.
And there's similar things.
I've got one.
Yeah, there's similar things in football, in soccer. So sure. I am terrible at understanding baseball, and it constantly pops up in a lot of academic literature. And I just people explain it to me. I've seen a couple of games. I've watched too much cricket. I'll never get baseball. I didn't play cricket. I watched a lot of cricket. I did play soccer and football. And one of the bits of feedback you get then is people say, look, you've got to keep your head up. Keep your head up and look around the field. And what happens with young players when they get the ball, and that is good advice, but what happens with young players is their first touch is poor. So whenever they get the ball, they're looking down at their feet. Okay, they look down at their feet because they don't have a great first touch and they're still learning the mechanics of touching the ball. So actually, if you say to someone learning to play football, if you say to them too early, keep your head up, well, they get the ball and they trip over the ball because they haven't got their first touch sorted.
Or it's very far away, and it doesn't matter that they've got their head up because their first touch was so bad.
Right.
The analogy. No, go ahead.
What you need to do in that situation is not say, keep your head up. You need to say, like, we're going to do some passing drills. And again, to go back to my example about this being not just true for novices, what do all the elite clubs do? And all the really good ones were pioneering and all the tiki-taka football and the new tactics. They do lots of passing drills, lots of small-sided passing drills where you're just trying to get that incredibly, incredibly beautiful, slick first touch that you don't even have to think about. And if you've got that and you can depend on that, sure, then you can get your head up and you can start looking around and scanning the pitch.
My other example, which I've joked about in print, is the advice, don't bunch up to young players. Young players all surge around the ball. And the parents are screaming on the sideline, don't bunch up. And every person there is saying, okay, let's stop for a minute. You run over it's useless. It makes the parents feel better. Yeah. But here's where I don't think it carries over into academic life. So let me give you that. When I think about a badly written essay where inference is inadequate, where background knowledge is insufficient, where vocabulary is limited, often I think sufficient advice in many situations is read more and write more. Practice doing this funny thing called thinking and this funny thing called writing. And I think I know I became a much better writer when I wrote more regularly. I don't think I ever wrote thoughtfully in the sense that I stepped back and said, now what can I do to make my writing better? I just wrote more and I read more, which also helps. They're obviously related. It's just not obvious to me that maybe it varies by age, but it's really hard. What you're really getting at when you say, let's do something more than tell people infer more thoughtfully, is you got to teach them how to think. And teaching people how to think, we're not that good at. And the process, by which we do it here at Shalem College, which I adore and love and have become a total drinker of the Kool-Aid, is read difficult texts in the presence of thoughtful people and discuss deep questions. And in that process, your brain will change in ways we don't really, I call it a black box. We don't understand that process very well. But I have no doubt that if it's taught well, meaning not explained, but then exploration takes place, that your brain will get better.
So again, I think there's some of that I'd agree with, some I disagree with. So, and I think some of it probably does, some of the differences I'm going to make here probably do apply to age. Maybe what you're saying is truer for the age group and the cohort you're teaching, whereas I'm thinking perhaps about younger and less able students.
Yeah.
Look, I love reading and writing. And I would agree with a lot of what you said there in my own personal life, in terms of you read more and you write more and you improve. And I would also say in some ways that chimes a bit with the point I'm making, in that you can read things that don't immediately seem directly linked to the thing it is that you're interested in. But the more you read and the more you know, the more you will be able to make links.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm very keen on, and which I've written about in my first book, is the value of knowledge and the value of committing knowledge to memory. Because people often talk about creativity as being about making connections in unusual ways, but to make those connections, you have to know some stuff to begin with to connect between them. So my argument is that a large part of education really does involve remembering things. And people don't often like the word memorization, but I think it is a crucial part of education. And I really dislike it when people talk about skills like creativity and communication in the abstract, that actually they are tied to specific bodies of domain knowledge. And I do think that the more knowledge you have and the more insights you have into different fields, the more connections and unusual connections you can make across those fields. So to that extent, I'd agree with you about reading more and writing more being important. I really don't like it, perhaps at primary and early secondary and even upper secondary, when the solution to everything is read more or write more. And one of the things that teachers will say a lot is, a lot of students, they just need to build their writing stamina. There is a problem akin to maybe trying to move on to running the marathon too soon if you try to get students to write too much too soon when they haven't built the building blocks, because they will build bad habits. They will embed those bad habits through repetition and through practice. This is a real issue, that if you have a student who has poured their heart and soul into a piece of writing and they really want you to read it and give feedback and engage with it, and they have so many technical errors that it is hard for you to read and engage it, that is a real problem. And so I do think there is an issue, a big issue, with running before you can walk. And that sometimes there is a pressure on teachers to, and I've seen this in the US and the UK, to think that the way you show advancement is to get students to write more, to get students to do more. So when you said the way this often transmits itself is learning by doing. And I want to nuance something I said before, because I talked about Polanyi and I talked about, look, you can't just read a book about riding a bike, you got to ride the bike. And so people often say, oh, that's learning by doing. I want to really heavily nuance learning by doing, okay? And this goes back to my marathon point. Let's think about, this is the best analogy to have with it. What I've said with a marathon is you do not want to go out and run a marathon in your first training session. You need to do some other activities which are going to help you build towards that. But obviously, if one of those activities is just reading a book about the marathon, that might be some help, but it's not enough. So I do agree you have to learn by doing. But what I don't agree is that the doing has to look like the end goal. Sometimes the doing has to look different. And for me, the goal of the teacher and the curriculum designer and the assessor who's building the assessments into this to give us the feedback is to design the right model of progression. Now, there can be wrong models of progression, because obviously what I'm saying here is you need to do stuff that doesn't look like the end goal. But there's a lot of things that don't look like the end goal, and some will be rubbish and won't help you to the end goal. So let's take the marathon example. If all you do before your marathon is read books about the marathon, that's not the right model of progression. That's not going to get you to run the 26 miles. And I agree, that can be an issue, because I think there's obviously sometimes going out for a run is cold and rainy, and is there something I can do that doesn't look like going out for a run? I'll stay in and I'll read the latest guide to the gear or whatever. So that is an issue. What I'm saying is you've got to construct a model of progression. And we have to test and get data and feedback on where, if that model of progression is the optimal way. And this is where sports are so interesting, because so many people are doing this for sports, and it is an incredibly intensive area, and people will get very irate about whether the Yasso 800 or the Lydiard method are the particularly best ways of getting you to your end goal of running a marathon in whatever time you want. So there are big arguments about the best types of progression model. But my point is that for all of us, we have to be building that progression model. And there will be some things in that progression model that do not look like that end goal. And if the only advice and feedback you are giving is just to read more and write more, I just don't think that's enough.
Fair enough.
Perhaps when you get closer, you're teaching at university, I'm guessing you probably got a pretty selective cohort. You've got students who can do the mechanics of reading and writing and have large vocabularies and already have some idea of different topics. And so, yes, for them, perhaps that's the right thing. Although I would say I do talk to university professors, and a lot of them say to me that even their undergrad and postgrad students it might help them to have some kind of a refresher or some kind of understanding of sentence structure. And I think that sentence structure is something that perhaps isn't taught enough, and people think you can just pick up from the environment. And another point I would make here is the challenge of just picking things up. The just pick it up. I call this the just pick it up fallacy. Is that if you're just relying on absorbing things from the environment, that is often not enough. So go back to my Polanyi bike riding example. Yes, I think you need to learn by doing, but I do think when you look at the way students do learn to ride a bike, it often isn't just get on and have a go. Like, there will be a parent helping them and riding them along for a bit. So what I'm saying is you learn by doing, but you learn by a kind of heavily structured, to begin with, a very heavily structured method that is avoiding you going off onto kind of rabbit holes and dead ends, that is keeping you on that straight and narrow. And then as you are getting better and better and better, obviously some of those guardrails, those stabilizers literally can be taken away, and you can have a little bit more freedom, and the feedback that you get can perhaps be a little bit more on the order of the read more, write more. But in those early stages of learning anything, you need structure, you need guidance, you do need to be doing, but you need to be doing within the guardrails. That would be my point. And to go back to all of this, prose is not optimized for any of this.
Well, I agree with all that, and I especially take the point that, for more advanced students, older students, read more, write more is actually, I would say, is a life strategy as much as anything else, and a lifelong learning strategy. It's not necessarily that helpful for, quote, mastering a particular discipline or subject at all.
Completely.
It's a much more general set of skills you're acquiring. I want to take us in a different direction. I want to pick a different example of pedagogy and see what you think of it. I learned this from Orson Scott Card, the science fiction writer, and he told me that he taught creative writing. He would ask people to write things, and he would grade them on it. But he would also grade them, and maybe overwhelmingly base the grade on the grades and feedback they gave their classmates. So you would be assigned a classmate, and you would have to read their essay and give them feedback, and you would write your own essay and take feedback about it from a classmate. And the reason I love that insight is that you could argue, not everybody would agree, but I would agree, you could argue that becoming a great writer requires being a great editor. Most of us don't write a great first draft. In fact, many people would say the goal of the first draft is just to get it down on paper. And that the way you become a good writer, meaning the way you produce a great essay or a great book, or even a great blog post or even a great tweet, is to improve the first draft. And so what this insight of Orson Scott Card is that that's what the bicycle that you need to learn how to ride. is the how to give yourself feedback, how to evaluate and judge your own writing. And you do that by practicing on the writing of others. And eventually you can find mistakes and ways to improve your own essays. And sometimes it's easier to see that in other people's work. And I think that's a profound insight about, at least about writing. I'm not going to say it's about anything else, but about this strange craft of becoming a better writer. Because, and I'll add one more thing. You can write down an algorithm for how to ride a bicycle. And I agree that reading the algorithm is not that helpful. It's through the experience of riding the bicycle that you acquire the skills of the algorithm. There's no algorithm for how to write a great essay. And so you're stuck. Okay, you could disagree with me, but I would say you're stuck. You know, there's certain rules of thumb. Vary the length of sentences. Don't use cliches. There's certain rules of thumb. But it's hard for me to imagine an algorithm. Maybe you'll prove me wrong. Go ahead.
So I think there are more algorithms than you think.
Okay.
And I think that one of the, so again, this is also, we have to think about what age range and what level of expertise are we dealing with. Now, what you've explained there is something that for a very expert small group of learners with a very expert teacher, I can see working well as a learning activity. Even then, I would say what that activity depends upon, and again, this is my marathon point, and again, this is like the iceberg point, is the small 1/8 of the thing you see above sea level is dependent on so much below sea level that is unseen. And whilst I can accept that that activity would work in that limited context, I suppose why I get slightly antsy about it is what I see in my day job and in my life is people saying, we are now going to take that and we are going to roll this out across the board, across ages 5 to 18, any kind of school anywhere, and we're going to make it a model for also how we give high stakes grades. And that happens.
Terrible idea. Terrible idea. I agree.
Right. And that is really, really problematic because what a lot of those students actually need is what I said before. So one of the biggest things which just gets taken for granted is vocabulary size. The vocabulary size correlates and is probably causative for so many other things. And there are so many students who simply, one of the things that is holding them back as writers is vocabulary. And actually, I would say you could argue that's pretty true of even some older students and postgraduate students, and maybe some of the students on this case too. So you're saying to me there's no algorithm for becoming a good writer. What I'm saying is, actually, I probably think 95% of what it takes to be a good writer is there are some algorithms that are teachable. And then there's probably some magic, inspirational, last mile 5%, which separates the solid and the good from the absolutely superb. But what I'm saying to you is, yes, okay, the person you mentioned, that if they're operating up there at that top 5% or even like 1% of the magic, the inspiration, what I'm talking about is I think there's an algorithm that gets you 95, 99% of the way that actually for the types of writing most people need to be doing for most of their life, I think it is possible to teach quite a lot of that. And all the stuff you're saying about very sentence length and sort of eye rolling a bit, I would say those things are quite important and they do reward practice. And I personally say, as someone who writes a lot and has written a few books, that I do pay an enormous amount of attention to that still, even as someone who is a published author, that I go back and I will look at every single sentence wherever I can and try to identify the subject, identify the verb. Steven Pinker writes very well about a lot of this, that if you go back over every sentence, identify the subject, identify the verb, that makes it really clear what's going on in that sentence. And that is a really useful discipline, I would argue, for 7-year-olds and for professional writers. And I'd be interested to see if you agree with that.
Oh, I agree with that 100%. In fact,
so there are some algorithms, and I would argue that a lot of published writers, we're in a world where anyone can open up a blog or a Substack or a Twitter tweet. A lot of published writers would benefit from that. So that algorithm, yes, there's an algorithm that would help a lot of people.
Well, actually, yeah, there's some tricks. That would be one of them. You could also, I have a trick as a writer where when I'm not happy with a passage, I take each paragraph, I reduce it to a single sentence. I lay the sentences out, and then I realize, oh, this sentence doesn't belong here, it belongs over here. Or I've said this sentence 2 different times in 2 different ways. And it's basically, it's post-writing outlining. I don't like to outline. I'm not sure it's a good algorithm. It's not a good algorithm for me. It could be for other people. And I do want to, kidding aside, and not mentioning my own marathon in 1977, which we're getting close to the 50th anniversary. I'm very excited about. And like you, I've only run one.
Yeah, one and done. That's me. One and done.
Blistering pace of 4 hours and 20 minutes.
I'm 3:55. I've got you there, Russ.
Well done. Bravo. So putting that to the side, I think there are tricks, and it's certainly the case that you can reverse outline like I did. You can outline beforehand can be useful for some people. You can look how many times you use the word it, which can often be a form of sloppiness and leads to confusion. I would say there are rules of thumb and tricks that help. What I think is harder is to teach people an algorithm for attacking an essay from scratch. That's what I meant to say. I think there are many algorithms for improving an essay, and certainly for becoming a good writer. Ernest Hemingway said, when asked by a young aspiring writer, how do you become a better writer? He said, read other writers so you know what the competition is that you have to beat. That's I don't think that's particularly good advice, at least for that reason. Let's shift gears, and I again, conceding that much of what you said is true. I want to talk about the use of large language models, AI, that you write about, because I think it'll highlight some of the challenges that we're talking about and where technology can help things and not. And you, in an essay, you start off by saying, in I think it was 2024, you thought it was January 2024, by January 2025, we'll be able to do this, that, and the other with AI, and you realized when January 2025 came along, that wasn't true. Talk about what was disappointing. Where has AI struggled? And in particular, I'm interested in the role of hallucinations and even of order, which you'll explain. It's kind of shocking.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have been working quite intensively to try and get large language models to improve feedback and improve grading. So all the things that I've been talking about before about written feedback, there are now a lot of organisations in this space trying to use large language models to provide students with better written feedback. We are starting from the position, obviously, that written feedback is not necessarily the optimal way of giving feedback. And so we are not just looking at ways LLMs will give that the traditional written feedback, but ways they can actually help move students on. So we are trying to do something even more than just provide the nice paragraph at the end of the piece of writing. So that's the world we're in, and we've been working at it very intensively. And you referred to a blog post we wrote just a couple of weeks ago where we talked about the journey we've had over the past few years and the ups and downs. And one of the major downs has been the propensity of large language models to hallucinate. And this is a huge problem if you want to automate something. So by hallucination, I just mean the types of errors, the types of mistakes, the ways that large language models are capable just of making stuff up. And actually, I listened to an episode you were doing a couple of weeks ago, was it with Reid Hoffman? And you were talking about how much you love using some of these large language models, but at one point you asked it something, you typed in a recent medical test you'd had, and the range of some numbers, and you said, is this range okay? And it came back and said, yeah, brilliant, it's great, you're in the range. And actually you went and looked it up, you were not in the range.
No.
Now that is the kind of thing I'm talking about. And honestly, we've been tearing our hair out over this for 2 years. Like we all, at the organisation, the company I work for, No More Marketing, this is what we dream and have nightmares about. Because the problem with these models, the thing that's so seductive and kind of reels you in and then they let you down is when they are good at something, they do something really well and it's brilliant. And you think, oh my goodness, this is amazing, it's going to change the world. But then what you need for it to really change the world is you need to be able to crank the handle and for it to do that consistently. Yeah. And what they do instead is they spit out these random, quite dangerous errors that they're incredibly confident about, of which your example is a very good one. And you are left there going, well, why did it do that? And the answer is nobody knows, because these models really are a black box. So the problem is that a lot of software systems depend on automation. So these things, and a lot of software, it depends on being deterministic, that you press a button, you press button X and Y happens. And we are now in a world where you press button X and maybe 95% of the time something of the order of Y happens, and 5% of the time something like Z is happening that is not what you wanted, and you don't know how to fix it. It's not a matter of just going in and debugging it. So this is a really big deal. And it's not a big deal. I get why people just on their own terms want to go in and use LLMs. I get that. I do that too. But it is a big deal if you want to start plugging stuff in and letting it work on its own, which is what, if you're a software company, effectively, which we are, people are used to being able to do. And so the big question then is, can you fix hallucinations? And obviously people will argue and argue and argue about, and this turns into a huge philosophical argument about, how do we know if technology is going to improve? Like, yes, on the one hand, Moore's law's been holding true for a very long time. On the other hand, people have been predicting energy that's too cheap to meter since the 1950s, and that hasn't happened. So, which predictions come true, which don't? And you can argue that out. A little thought experiment I like to play with people is, would you recommend a 17-year-old today should learn to drive? Yes or no?
Good question.
Yeah.
Good question.
And it is. And what's really interesting is a lot of people who've previously...
The answer is yes.
Well, I live in London, so the answer in London is possibly, not connected to self-driving cars because, you have good public transport here, whatever. But I think in most parts of the developed world, the answer is yes. And what's really interesting is when I ask people this, even people who have been really gung-ho about LLMs and say, the hallucinations, they'll be fixed before long. Don't worry your little brain about those. When I say to them, would you ask a 17-year-old to learn to drive? They'll say, yeah, for sure. Okay, so that's just a way of putting a bit of a number on it of how certain are you.
Daisy, you might not teach them to drive a stick shift, which
oh my God,
used to be...
everyone in the UK drives a stick shift. Russ,
well, in America you would.
Come on.
In America you would.
Russ, I live in London and don't own a car, and I drive a stick shift. There's no such thing as an automatic in the UK. No, you're right,
Depends
and obviously...
on the place.
All the electric cars now don't have a gear. We tend to talk about the gear in the automatic. And actually, my colleague bought a new electric car the other day and it didn't have a gear. I was like, oh my God.
But to give people a better idea of this hallucination problem, I think what most people think hallucinations are about is, making up authors and getting facts wrong. Talk about, let's do a little review here because it's I love this insight of yours. About comparative judgment. Talk about why comparative judgment is so powerful in with humans and how it failed with LLMs, at least so far. Yeah. Because it's shocking.
Right. So I think a lot of the people who are trying to get LLMs to support with marking and assessment, what they will do is they will they'll send the essays off to the LLM and ask them to give it a mark out of whatever or give it a grade. And we've done a lot of that. And the thing is, humans are not very good at that, and actually we've found the LLMs are not particularly brilliant at it either. But obviously, our big insight from our organisation is that comparative judgment, humans are much better at comparative judgment than at absolute judgment. So the comparative judgment is instead of looking at one essay or one piece of student writing and trying to place it on a mark scheme, you look at two, you say which is better, you collect thousands, hundreds of thousands of judgments like that from lots of different teachers. You can use the algorithm to combine them all, create the measurement scale. So that's how comparative judgment works. And what is really interesting, human comparative judgment is the gold standard of human judgment. And most of these large language models are trained on human comparative judgment. So when you read any of the LLM research papers about how they create them, they will talk about using a corpus of human comparative judgment as the training data for the LLM. And you yourself, if you use LLMs a lot, I'm sure you've come across this. Do you ever see sometimes you ask it a question, it will give you two responses and it will say, which do you prefer? You come across that?
I haven't had that.
You haven't had that?
No.
Okay. Maybe it's just me. This happens to me all the time. Maybe I'm just more aware of it. What's happening there is the LLMs, they are gathering the comparative judgment data from the users in real time. So they will have two slightly different models. Each model will spit out an answer. The LLM will ask you, which do you prefer? You will pick the one you prefer, and they will use that data and all the other data they're getting to decide which model is better. Okay, so human comparative judgment is being used all the time in the creation and the refinement of large language models. So what we thought is, well, why don't we get the LLMs to do some comparative judgment? Humans are better at comparative judgment than absolute judgment. Maybe LLMs will be better at comparative judgment than absolute judgment. And so, yes, they were better, but they also displayed some very interesting biases and errors which are not present in humans. And one of the most interesting was position bias. So position bias, if you think about comparative judgment, you're being presented with two responses. You've got one on the left and one on the right. And as a human, you have to look at both of them and say which you think is better. Now, we, I think, have processed about 40 million human judgments using our software, and we have found that humans do not display significant position bias. So I think I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think something like 50.5% of judgments, human judgments, are for the left, and 49.5% are for the right. So because that's such a big number, that is significant, but it is tiny. It's very small. So essentially, our humans are not displaying any kind of position bias. They're not really influenced by whether something is shown on the left or shown on the right. That is not true of large language models. So large language models, in the research we've done and the research lots of other people have done, they do show position bias, by which I mean they will change their mind if a piece is presented on the left or the right. So you have piece A and piece B. If the LLM sees it in order A on the left, B on the right, it might pick A, and if those are reversed, it might pick B. And it does tend to be, I think, what we've seen, the position bias is to the left, the piece that it's on the left. It's not just us who found that, others have found that. The extent to which it is a problem varies. And there are some models where it's not as bad as others. In the ones we've been looking at, it's kind of varied from sort of 10 to 25%. That is quite a big deal. So in terms of getting artificial intelligence, large language models to support with human judgments, that's an issue. But what I'm going to say is there are ways we can mitigate these issues. And what I want to talk about is where we are at the minute with hallucinations and with these kinds of errors is that there are a lot of people who are just like, look, hallucinations will be fixed, they'll be solved, don't worry about them, just crack on as if they didn't exist. We actually don't think that. I think they're a bit more of a feature than a bug. But I think there are other ways that LLMs can and are improving, particularly to do with cost, that allow you to come up with some workarounds for some of these problems. And if you can, the big buzz phrase at the minute, the human in the loop, if you can use a human in the right way in your process to correct and address some of these errors, LLMs do have a role to play. So the place we are at the minute is we're not ignoring hallucinations. We don't think they're going to be solved anytime soon. We're trying to find ways that we can plug them into a system and mitigate these problems.
So let's talk about the human in the loop, and in particular, I want to bring it back to our earlier conversation about written feedback versus actionable follow-up steps. So talk about where you are, how you're using humans with AI to improve and scale is part of the biggest problem, feedback, because grading and feedback are both incredibly time intensive. And the reason that the AI is so deeply appealing and the reason people want to believe that the hallucinations will get fixed is that it takes a tedious and frustrating and incredibly time intensive process called grading or marking and then feedback, and it solves it really cheaply. But if it does it poorly, that's not a solution. So talk about how you're integrating humans and AI.
Absolutely. So in terms of that specific grading issue, what we can do, and this is where the recent cost reductions matter. So as I say, I'm not so optimistic that these LLMs are going to start to completely eliminate hallucinations anytime soon. I am more optimistic that the costs will keep coming down. And so obviously DeepSeek, this sort of new, cheaper Chinese model, has already sparked a bit of a price war. And that makes a difference because it means you can start to do some interesting things. So one thing that was probably a little bit prohibitive before these cost reductions is what we can do now is we can send every piece off to be comparatively judged twice, each way round. And then we can identify the ones where it's disagreeing with itself. And then once you've identified those, what we've also done is some analysis, this was really important, is what kinds of pieces is it disagreeing on? So is it disagreeing on pieces where you just look at it and go, I have no idea that those two pieces, it's obvious one is so much better than the other? Or is it pieces that are actually quite close in standard? And currently what we seem to be thinking it is pieces that are a little bit closer. So that's a bit more reassuring. And then what we can do is we can say, well, if the 90%, if the 75 to 90% is getting right, that's okay. That we can then get the humans to mop up the remaining ones. So we can direct the human attention that doesn't have that position bias on those pieces which the LLM is finding trickier. There are other potential solutions, again, some of which would be more facilitated by having cheaper LLM requests. So there are all of a sudden things you can start to do. What you can also start to do is we've built a very powerful statistical model, as I say, based on assessing over 2 million pieces of writing over the last sort of 7 or 8 years. And you can start to, it's not about training a model necessarily, but actually starting to use that statistical model in ways to identify the flaws and the failings of the LLM, correct them, and then use the human judgment very strategically and in a targeted fashion to address those weaknesses. So that's kind of where we are with grading. And I would say as well, this is all a work in progress. Like you talked to me, we've got a big trial project running at the minute that will report at the end of this month, and we will know a lot more then about what is and is not possible. But that's where we are at the moment. At saying we can use the human judgment in this, as I say, more strategic, more targeted way to address some of the weaknesses of the LLM, and that's specifically on the grading issue.
But you also had something creative on the feedback, which was the making an audio recording. Talk about that.
Absolutely. So on the feedback side of things, I've talked about the grading and how we're using the human in the loop there. On the feedback issue, again, we've been struggling with this for a couple of years. So one model we started out with is let's just do direct AI feedback. And a lot of people are looking at this too. So you give the essay to the LLM and you say, give me some improvements for the student, give me some feedback, give me that typical written paragraph. And right from sort of day one of a lot of these LLMs, they would do this in a way that was superficially incredibly impressive. They would turn out a beautifully polished paragraph that it would have taken a teacher, hours to do that for everyone in their class. So again, your initial thing is, wow, this is amazing. Like, if it can work, the amount of time this is going to save. But then when you start to dig deeper, you hit problems. So the first problem is it is very good at producing something that is relatively kind of superficial and generic. And once you start to push it and ask it to be more specific and do the things I've talked about before about we have to be constructing some specific action steps and a model of progression, a recipe for feedback, actual things you need the student to go away and do to get better, that's when it starts to break down. And that's when the errors start to creep in. And those errors are a big problem because if you're just going to, again, automation, you're just going to push it back to students. If those feedback items and actions have mistakes in them, that is incredibly, incredibly confusing for students. Okay? So our initial thought was, well, what we'll do is we'll get the AI, and this was all kind of about 2 years ago, we'll get the AI, get the LLM to provide the written feedback. We'll put it in a nice, before it goes to the student, the human in the loop will be the teacher who will read the student's essay, check the LLM feedback, and make any edits. So we built that editable interface. The problem with this is that all of the teachers universally came back to us and said, the time it takes for me to read the original essay, read what the AI has written, decide if it's good enough or not, and make the changes, I may as well have marked it all myself. And they are right about this, and this is a massive problem in the literature of all, even pre-LLM, all automation research. And there is actually a whole theme in the literature called the paradox of automation. And the paradox of automation is that, and you see this with self-driving cars, it's a huge issue for self-driving cars, is that when you have a system that is 95% okay, but there's 5 to 10% of errors, actually asking humans to stay switched on to spot the 5-10% of errors, they would actually be easier and you would get better outputs overall if they just did the whole thing themselves. And self-driving cars have this problem in spades, that they can drive quite effectively, depending on the model, depending on where you are in the world. They probably can do 80, 90, maybe 95% of the driving themselves. But, and you see this with Teslas, they will then need the human to be able to react to something that they can't handle. And what we know from real life practice and research is that if the human is sitting there texting and not paying attention to the road and they suddenly get a warning that to something the AI can't handle, the human does not have enough time to quickly switch on and take over the controls and attune themselves to everything that's going on and start driving again. That they just can't do it. It's safer for them to just be driving all the time. Okay, because they would be more switched on and attuned to their environment. Imperfectly, of course, driving, they will have accidents, but it's a different kind of accident than Let me take that point, because that is a really crucial point, okay? And this is a really crucial point where we've all had a little bit of a sea change here, is that when LLMs first came along, and indeed, same with self-driving cars, the thing you hear a lot of people say is, yes, the self-driving cars have accidents, yes, LLMs make mistakes, but humans do too. Obviously, humans have car accidents. Obviously, teacher-written feedback is not optimal. It's not perfect.
Sometimes it's bland and generic.
Right. And sometimes it's really delayed, okay? So I was chatting to a friend's child recently, and I said, what do you think about feedback in your school? And she goes to a very expensive independent school, and she said, well, I handed in a piece in November, and it's now February, and I still haven't got it back. Okay? So you don't get that with an LLM, right?
Yeah.
So if you'd asked me 3 years ago, the big debate that I'm referring to here is expert human judgment versus statistical algorithms. And there is a big literature on this. And if you had asked me 3 years ago, I and everyone at my company, we would have come down firmly on the statistical judgment side of things, okay? And that was like almost our calling card. One of my colleagues, Dr. Chris Whedon, he'd written a big paper in specifically the context of exam assessment, where he talked about all the issues with human judgment and all of the important and good things about using statistical judgment instead. And the classic kind of statement of this in the research, Paul Meehl, who wrote a really big thing about this, about how even a really simple basic algorithm will often outperform a human expert. And that is because the algorithm will be consistent. It will give you the same result every time. Like, that's a major, major advantage of an algorithm over a human. Okay, and people at the time of Meehl's research, they hated it. This is wrong. Really? And another debate a bit later that's really good on this: Daniel Kahneman versus Gary Klein. And they talk about experts, and they talk about experts versus algorithms. And they actually have a very, very good productive paper where they are both on opposite sides of this divide, but they write a very good paper teasing out where it is they agree, where it is they disagree, which is just fantastic. It's really, really good. And it's actually, the answer is, it's all to do actually with feedback. It's about what are the kinds of expert fields where you get really good feedback. And in those fields, the expert will be a true expert who will actually make really good decisions. But in the kinds of fields where the expert doesn't get great feedback, they will often end up actually sometimes making bad decisions, and then you're better off relying on the algorithm. Okay, so feedback is important everywhere. But to go back to this point, if you'd asked me 3 years ago, I was on the statistical judgment side of things. And I'd seen so many issues with human judgment, human error. The thing the algorithm will always have is consistency and its speed. And by implication, it's cheap, right? And these things will mean it's always got that advantage. I have really changed and nuanced my position on this for a number of reasons. One of them is LLMs, that they do not have the same consistency as the old style algorithms. So LLMs isn't that you crank the handle and they spit out the same thing. Like, in one sense, they are more like humans, so they are inconsistent. But then in another sense, they're not like humans because the type of errors they make are not like human errors. So even though the overall, so what you're ended up in a weird situation is you're ended up where the overall consistency and accuracy of an LLM and a human, perhaps in certain cases it is the same. But the type of errors LLMs make are different. And again, I gave you that example of the position bias. That's an error the LLM making that the human is not making. And the same is true again with self-driving cars. They make weird errors that humans don't make. And why this matters is you have a system, the road system, the exam and assessment system, that is built to handle human error. And maybe it doesn't always handle it very well, but it's a system that has safeguards built in to address the typical human error. So an obvious example with roads is if a human makes a really crazy error on the road, there's often some kind of sanction, or they might be breathalyzed, they might get banned from driving. What do you do when a self-driving car just does something really weird and unexpected? Like, you can't just ban the car. Would you ban the entire model? Like, what do you do? And the same is true with exams and assessment. And there are loads of people in exams and assessment trying to wrap their heads around this at the moment. And it's really difficult because if you have a human marker in a high-stakes exam who makes a mistake, we have a system to handle that, and we have a hierarchy, and you can send that back for a review to the senior marker. And I'm not saying those systems are perfect, and I know very well that they're not perfect, but they are a system that we have built to capture the kind of errors and manage the kind of errors we have. And there's also a kind of social ethics that if a kid has been given a really rogue, wrong grade, the kid and the parent, they want to know that there's some kind of thing that you can't just shrug your shoulders and go, well, yeah, the AI kind of, I don't know, it's a black box. There has to be something built into that. So these are all the things. I'm not saying I'm giving up on algorithms, but the whole debate is way more complicated and way muddier than it was 3 years ago.
But I want you to talk about the way you did figure out a way to use AI.
Right. Exactly. So my point was that the very simple, straightforward way of saying, well, we'll just get the teacher, we'll get the human to look over what the AI said. No, that is the equivalent of the Tesla driver. Just wake up, just come off your phone when there's a big truck bearing down on you. Not going to work. What we did instead, we flipped things around and we said, okay, whilst the teachers are judging, so whilst they're making their decisions, they will leave an audio comment on the piece of writing. And because of the way we set things up, that means every piece will get several audio comments. And then we use the AI in two ways. The first thing is to transcribe the audio comments. And the second is to combine all of those audio comments into some written feedback for the students. So how's that different from what we've done before? Well, the feedback is coming from the human. It is human teacher feedback. It's not direct AI feedback. But we are using the AI to do things that it is much better at, where it makes fewer mistakes, fewer issues around hallucinations, transcribing and combining. And what is also really good about this is the time reductions, the cost savings for teachers. What I realised when I started using this is that so much of the time I would spend writing a comment on students' work, a lot of the time I would spend it kind of trying to nuance it and not be too mean or too blunt to the student. Yeah. Whereas what's great about this system is you can be quite blunt with your audio feedback, and we've set it up so the AI will soften it. So I would probably not, on an 8-year-old's piece of work, write terrible handwriting. But with this, you can say terrible handwriting, and 4 people could say terrible handwriting, and the AI will nuance it really nicely, and it will say, you've made a fantastic response to this question, but you do need to work on the legibility of your handwriting because it is making it hard for the teacher to read, or something like that. We'll make it easier for the student to understand. So that is a huge time saver. However, does it fall into the pitfalls I was talking about of, I've just been saying all this written feedback's not worth the paper it's written on? I'll address that. I can address that in a moment too.
Well, why don't you address it now? Because I want to shift gears and close with something really different.
So then, yes, this written feedback that I'm talking about, you might be thinking, well, I spent all this time saying prose is not optimized for improvement, and here I am spending all this time essentially getting the students a nice paragraph of prose. Why are we bothering with this? Okay, so actually what we can also do with all of these audio comments is we can put together a feedback report for the teacher. So this will be a summary of all of the audio comments of all of the students in your class, and it will categorize them, and it will say what are the themes that kept coming up again and again. And we hope actually in time, we will then add to it with then suggested activities, suggested model of progression, action step. And our thinking is that is far more useful, to go back to my original thermostat thermometer point, that is far more useful in terms of being the thermostat, because that is going to give the teacher the insights they need to replan and adjust their sequence of teaching to address the issues they've seen and make sure they're not being seen in the next piece of writing. So actually, the way I'm seeing it is that written feedback report is actually the really the best output of what we're doing. But if, as a complete, as a byproduct that takes no extra time, we can add the paragraph in for the student. The other thing we have also realised is I've been very harsh on written feedback and I've had a go at it, but one of the things that we've not considered about the value of it, and this is something that recurs again and again in the human technology debate, is one of the big pushbacks I will get from teachers who do broadly agree with me on written feedback not being that optimal, is they will say, but the kids like it. It motivates the students. They want to feel seen. And a lot of the teachers I talk to will also say that is why they're actually quite reluctant to move to direct AI feedback. Because if you are in a situation where the student knows that their work is not being read by a teacher, actually, where is the motivation for them to want to put their heart and soul into it? And what people have loved about the initial prototypes of this version, and we have got some incredible feedback on it, is that you can actually say to the student, this feedback you're getting, this paragraph, it's from like 4 or 5 different teachers in the school. And what we've found as well is the best kind of audio feedback is when the teacher picks out something, a nice word or a phrase in the student's writing and says, I love it when you say X. And if a couple of teachers do that, that will feature in the feedback the students get. So our initial findings are that the thing people like the most about it, and the thing where I will say written feedback does offer something, is the feeling of the work being seen, and the student feeling seen, and the student feeling motivated to want to do their best because a teacher who they know and respect is reading it and paying it attention. So we think where we are now, we've alighted on something that kind of is working, but it is early days and we ourselves need to gather more feedback.
And of course, one would hope that a student-teacher interaction is more than a paragraph at the bottom of the page.
Of course.
After they've received the piece of paper with the reaction, there could be a future conversation or three where it'd be awkward if the teacher said, well, yeah, I didn't read it. I didn't actually read it. The machine read it, but it's makes some good points.
Yeah.
So it keeps the human connection part that's important. I want to close with a radical shift here. I think about this a lot, president of a college, and we're grappling, of course, with the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the essence of our academic pedagogical approach is the reading and writing around not just great books, but great books and difficult texts and challenging things. And we want our students to struggle and to work and to improve. And suddenly they have access to a tool that you really can't figure out whether they've used it or not, which allows them to take some extraordinary shortcuts. And I just want to mention, we teach in Hebrew, and I'm sure you could get a nice published paper out of redoing the A-B comparison in Israel, where we read right to left, because I have a feeling that maybe some of that ordering disagreement is because you read it first. I don't know.
I did actually know. I did think about that, but it's interesting. It's not present with the humans. It's present with the AI.
A little bit. No, you said it's a little bit present.
Tiny,
Because it's sitting right there next to it. It's not like you read it and then put it down. You read another one, you put it down. But anyway, so we're grappling with this, and our students are grappling with it. They, a non-trivial proportion of our students, we hope almost all of them, don't want to cheat. They don't, and I don't mean cheat in the grade sense. I mean, they don't want to cut corners. They want to do the work because we believe that the work is the black box that creates much of the power of the educational transformation that we think happens here. So that's the frightening part of AI for education, that it'll be very difficult to assess people's actual abilities. Because they won't do the reading. They'll ask the AI to summarize it. They won't do the writing. They'll have the AI write it. And people have suggested, well, that's why there's going to be a lot more in-person grading, in-person essay writing, so you can't use the AI and so on. I don't know how that's going to play out. I think it's going to get really complicated because it's really, I think it's going to have some incredible changes to the educational system. And I want to focus on one of those, which is AI as tutor. And one of the things I've been impressed with, there's a handful. It's not a long list, but it's long enough to change the world. If you want to understand something, or if you want to drill, like you, I believe that facts are really important. And it's hard to, when you say students need better vocabulary, I would suggest, but this is just my own personal bias, I have no idea if it's true, the way you get a better vocabulary is to read more. And see words in context. And it's hard to, some people don't grow by drilling, memorizing words and repeating them back. They only maybe the human brain is better at just seeing them in context. So let's think about how we might use AI in a perfect world. And I'll say what I mean by that. In a perfect world, you're not being motivated by grades, marks, you're just trying to educate. So this could be you could think about this as a homeschooling world. And I'm thinking about the following. I have to write an essay. I'm not doing it for a grade. So I don't care that the first draft's not very good. So you're my human tutor, and I go and you give me an assignment and I write an essay. And then we sit down and look at it. And we realized, it's not very good. And we could talk about, forget the paragraph at the bottom, we could have a conversation about what's imperfect about it. And if you were a great writer, and you're a very good writer, maybe a great one, and I was a bad writer, I'd love to sit at your feet and be tutored by you and walk through in an ongoing dialogue about how I can do that better. It would be constrained by the fact that that's incredibly time intensive. You don't have time for every one of these curious students who want to improve. But that AI never gets tired. It never gets bored, at least so far. And so I'm thinking, wouldn't I be able to use that in an extraordinary way? Not in the way you need in your company to assess, say, school performance or curriculum performance, but let's just say the only goal was to help me, the student, be a better writer. Forget about schools. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write my essay, and I know it's not very good. I know AI could have done it better. Claude could improve it. So instead of saying, Claude, make this better so I can hand it in and pretend it's mine, I say to Claude, how would you have written this? And teach me what I did wrong. In other words, don't give me the paragraph at the end, because that's awful. Maybe we'd go paragraph by paragraph. We might also step back and look at the whole essay. I could say, could you give me an outline that would have done a better job than mine? There's so many ways to use AI now as a tutor to help me learn how to ride the bicycle, right? I don't want to give you, if the goal was to give you a video of me riding the bicycle, so instead of bothering to learn, I just have AI make a video and send it in as my assignment. You go, oh, I guess he did learn. Instead, I'm going to say, AI, help me do this. But it won't do very good at riding the bicycle. But I think it could be very good at helping me to become a better writer, and for it to both give me assignments, challenge me for what I think needs to be better about this paragraph, maybe. Having said that, I'm not so impressed with its ability to write coherent essays. But if I'm a bad essay writer, I think there's a lot of room for improvement that AI could tutor me on. What do you think of that?
Where do I start? This is all really interesting. I could do another hour on this. Can I just say, want to say one thing about where you opened that question with, which is a little bit tangential, but I really want to address it because it is very important to me. That you
Please.
said in an ideal world, we wouldn't have an assessment, maybe we'd be homeschooling, and we just want to be learning for the sake of learning without the grade. This is something I hear again and again. And I want to push back. And one of the things I love about your podcast in general is how you really get the price function. And you get that the price function in economics is not this nasty, oppressive, evil thing that is just used to impose scarcity on people. You get that the price function is a marvel. It is the thing that allows us to measure our wants and direct energy and attention and innovation to where it needs to go. And my point is, assessment is the price function of education. You can't just turn around and go, in an ideal world, my ideal education system has no assessment. That's like saying my ideal market-based system has no price. Russ, you Soviet.
I'm so proud of you. It's a great critique.
Okay.
You win. I love it. Of course. I meant there'd be.
I like to call myself.
Critique.
I like to call myself a pro-exam romantic because I know how exams go wrong. I'm not naive, and I know how the extrinsic motivation. If you just only have that and you don't have the love of learning, of course I know how that goes wrong. And of course my dream as a teacher and as a student all the time is to get your students up to that bit where they love the learning. Just as you want to be in a job where you love the job and you're not just doing it for the money. Of course, I get that. But I also, again, live in, that's why I say pro-exam romantic, okay, that I think all that can happen. And I think all that is not inimical to exams or prices or salaries. That actually is part of it. And again, I talked about Dylan William earlier. He has a little phrase where he says, assessment operationalizes the curriculum. That you have all these highfalutin dreams about what you want to do, but is the assessment where the rubber hits the road. And you really kind of say, this is what we want. So I had to get that out of the way before addressing.
And before you do, before you get to the addressing, I agree with you 100%. I didn't mean to imply that in a perfect world, we'd all learn for the sake of learning, because learning's hard work.
Exactly.
And mastery is hard work. And the assessment should tell you where you need to work harder in some areas and where you can rest on your laurels a little bit in others. So 100%, and the analogy is an A+. I'm giving you 100. And in fact, I'm going to 103 because the scale doesn't even allow me enough room to fully praise that answer. Brilliant, so carry on.
Brilliant. All right. So then addressing your point about the AI tutor. Now, look, we haven't delved into enormously in this episode kind of cognitive science and the way we learn and the bottlenecks on our cognition. I alluded to them a little bit when I was talking about my marathon analogy, about breaking things down, about how you can't just focus on the end goal if you want to get better at the end goal. I haven't addressed all of that. You, in a previous episode, have had Daniel Willingham on. Daniel Willingham is a huge influence on my work. My first book, 7 Myths About Education, is very, very Willingham influenced. And essentially, when we are thinking about how we learn, we have to take into account a lot of what we know about the science of learning. A lot of the science of learning is providing a rationale for a lot of what I've said about why you have to break things down. And the reason you have to break things down is we have a very limited working memory, which is a limit to the amount of information we can process in the environment. And we have this vast long-term memory, which we can use all the information we have stored in long-term memory to address the limitations, the bottleneck of working memory. And so this is one of the reasons why I think education, this is a solid scientific rationale, it's not just kind of prejudice and traditionalism, for why education should be focused on memorization and remembering things. The concern I've always had with letting kids loose either on an AI, an LLM, or indeed, 20 years ago, what was all the rage? They don't need to learn things anymore. You can just Google it.
Look them up.
Yeah, right? And there's a solid scientific rationale why you can't do that. You can't outsource memory. You have to have the facts in long-term memory. My concern with LLMs at the moment is it's the new, you can just look it up. It's the new, you don't have to learn to write, the LLM will do it for you. You don't have to learn to do this, the LLM will do it for you. And also that you can just type in a question and get an answer from the LLM. Now, even if we overcome hallucinations, and as I say, I'm not sanguine that's going to happen in the short term, right? But even if we can overcome hallucinations, even then, my worry would be that it's almost a form of discovery learning, and that novices in particular, are they going to be asking the right questions? Do they have enough background knowledge to interrogate the answer that they're getting? That all of the problems we had with the you can just Google it issues 20 years ago, we're just going to have a game with LLMs, except we've got this other added worse problem, which is they're not even that reliable. Again, I think we have a slight expert novice issue. I am just geared because of my job towards thinking about younger, less expert student. You are geared a bit more towards thinking about older and more expert students. I would agree they have more applications for the older, more expert student, fewer for the younger. I do have concerns about how they're used. I do agree with you. What's the thing? They never get tired. They can always provide another example. For a more expert, advanced student with the background knowledge to interrogate them and to ask the right question, they can add value. I also worry, and I worry this about everything that LLMs do, is they are so focused on language and they're so good at language. And look, my day job is writing assessment and language assessments, and my degree is in literature. But what you realise is language is not always optimised for truth and precision. And I can't remember if I said this in our previous episode, but if you look at what people think, what is the evolutionary origin of language, that the evolutionary origin of language is to kind of lie and tell nice stories about ourselves. And the reason I think we kind of, as a species, invent sort of numbers and mathematics is to get around some of the limitations with language. So again, comes back to that Polanyi point about prose, that I worry that you can read a really nice example on an LLM and maybe it is accurate and you can think you've understood it, but what you really need is more practice, and you need to be having, you need to be, another insight from cognitive science, you need to be testing yourself. You need to be self-quizzing. You need to be, we know at the moment that when you ask students to revise, their number one go-to strategy is the least effective strategy, which is they will reread their notes and highlight them. And I've seen this in action. I've seen students who reread their notes, they'll highlight them. I remember one student had highlighted the whole page apart from one word, the. Well, what good is that going to do, right? What you need to be doing, all the research says, is testing yourself, quizzing yourself. So put the book away, put the notes down. How much can you remember? Flashcards, fill in the blank. Can you write down this equation? Can you remember exactly what Paul Samuelson talks about when he says stated and revealed preferences? Can you draw me a graph? Doing all these things, that's what really helps you learn. Now, of course, I can see ways in which an LLM, you could train one to understand all that and to prompt you for that. But I am worried that just letting students loose on them, there's going to be all those issues. So I'm I'm really wary about younger kids. I'm super wary, and I hear things that I just feel, oh gosh, this is awful. I'm maybe less worried about postgraduates. I'm very good undergraduates, but I still have my concerns.
Well, I think we'll probably need a human in the loop as the younger you are, for sure. I don't think we'll ever solve that problem perfectly with the LLM that, you go lock a child away for 8 hours a day, and at the end of the year, they're going to be...
the other point I'll say about sort of, and my third book, Teachers versus Tech, I write quite a bit about to what extent education, technology can support. And the whole thing about technological substitution is there are a lot of places where we get it working really well, and it's brilliant, and it means you get more stuff cheaper, and it's fantastic. There are a lot of areas where the human is kind of the thing you want. And that actually bringing in something that is fungible and changeable, with young children, you have a different teacher every day. That doesn't work. There has to be that stability and that human connection. And in my book, Teachers versus Tech, I look at a lot of the ways technology can help with education. But I think that the huge issue, which I wrote my book about this just in 2019, and it was published like the week before kind of COVID, all the COVID lockdown started. But I would say it's pretty much been kind of vindicated by COVID in that if we really were willing to have kids sit at a screen all day and learn, and if that was an optimal way of learning and they could learn, COVID would have made it happen. And in reality, we had the kind of almost perfect chance for technology to prove itself, that if it was possible for a 7-year-old to learn what they needed at school, not at school, but by sitting in front of a screen, I think someone would have cracked it during COVID. And the reality is that in most countries, people really wanted the schools to open. And people really thought, hang on a minute, they're not learning what they need to on a screen. So I think there's some stuff you can deliver down a wire and on a screen and people are fine with it and you don't lose very much. I think there is other stuff where you do lose stuff. And I think the education of young students is something where I think we just had the perfect global experiment. If we had the answer, we would have found it then. So that makes it harder to scale things up. And that doesn't make me necessarily happy, because I'm someone who thinks to increase quality and to get consistent quality, you do need technology and you do need to find a way of doing things at scale. So I'm not saying that's a great thing, but I'm saying this is not an easy problem to crack. And a lot of the tools and techniques we've used in other sectors where it is easier to deliver stuff down a wire don't really read across in the same way.
My guest today has been Daisy Christodoulou. Daisy, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Sure. Cheers, Russ. Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.